A few weeks ago, I asked myself a really stupid question. Why the stomach? If you were a samurai and you decided today was the day you're gonna die, why would you open your stomach? It's not fast, it's not painless. If anything, it might be one of the worst ways to go. Why not just stab your heart and try to go instantly? And the answer, I thought would be the same as the popular belief that I keep hearing from most documentaries and from people in Japan. The samurais cut open their stomach because they believed that their soul lives there and they did it for their honor. But it wasn't. It wasn't like that at all. I'll walk you through what I found. So the Japanese word to cut open your stomach and commit suicide is seppuku. And I decided to go back as far as I possibly could about the roots of seppuku. 14,000 years ago, during the Jomon period, people in Japan were already making these clay figures called dogu. And a huge number of them share one exaggerated feature, swollen or pregnant bellies. Probably prayers for safe childbirth or good harvests. And this is thousands of years before Japan had any real contact with any other countries. So before a single foreign idea ever touched Japan, the stomach already meant something here. But I wanted to know where the specific idea that the soul lives in the stomach came from. And that actually took me to China. So you know how you hear the word ki in animes like Dragon Ball? Oh, you gotta control your ki, or his ki is so huge. Well, that concept came from China, but it didn't start off the way it's used today, or at least in the anime world. In ancient China, around 700 BC, the word ki, or in Chinese, qi, just meant fog or mist. It was something used only to express weather. Then, as time went by, they started to make this connection that I find beautiful. On a cold day, when you breathe out, we can also make a little fog or mist, a qi, but with your breath. And when you die, you can no longer make those qi. Therefore, qi became more than a meaning of just fog or dew. It started to mean life or soul. Then, around 500 BC, a philosopher named Lao Tzu wrote about something he calls the Tao, the way. He says the universe has this natural flow, the Tao, and suffering comes from fighting it. The best way to live this life is to go with the flow. This idea is very abstract, almost impossible to pin down, which is sort of the point. A couple of centuries later, scholars from the Chinese royal court tried to make Lao Tzu's abstract Tao actually useful for running a country. They wanted a tangible skill that would help the country's leaders run the country better. The content of it is, if a person trains to calm their mind and cultivate their qi, they can gain clarity, self-control, and wisdom, which in turn will help the country. At almost the same time, a completely unrelated obsession is running in Chinese royal courts. Immortality. Rulers are funding expeditions and alchemists to find a physical elixir of eternal life. But it doesn't work. Some rulers even died from taking these magical potions, mercury. After generations of failed immortality potions, they started to flip the method around. Instead of bringing something outside the body and taking it in for eternal life, they decided to cultivate what already exists inside. And out of all the places in the body, one place was specifically focused. A place called tanden, which is located about 3 fingers below your belly button. The idea was to knead and polish your qi at your tanden through super focused breathing, escalate it a couple more channels in your body, and then you'll be immortal. Further down the road, around 100 AD, all of this, Lao Tzu's Tao, wisdom through qi, the immortality chased by focused breathing on the tanden, plus a few older folk beliefs, merges into an organized religion, Taoism. And this Taoism came over to Japan, but only in fragments and over centuries and by different people. So the information about Taoism was very scattered in Japan. And that's the Chinese side of the research I did. And I was quite happy that I found the origin of where I've been hearing that the soul lives in the belly. But I wasn't too sure if that actually had any connections to samurais committing seppuku. In order to find out, I went back to researching Japan. So the earliest seppuku historians generally agree really happened is in 1180. It was done by a defeated warrior, Minamoto no Yorimasa, on the losing side of a civil war. His reasons for seppuku were quite practical. You see, if the enemy captures him, they would take his head as a trophy. So instead of the enemy cutting his head, he would have liked to cut his own head to avoid shame. But that isn't something you can really do effectively by yourself. But the stomach, he can reach it, control it, make sure his death happens on his own term. And what's even more interesting is that he chose the stomach to commit suicide because there's no major artery there. It doesn't kill you fast. It kills you slowly. Slowly enough that everyone watching gets to see how much he can endure pain, how much of a warrior he truly is. So basically, it was more of a performance to make the enemy afraid or respect him. But as you may have noticed, the seppuku around that time didn't involve the concept of soul, Tao, Tanden, nothing from that entire Chinese theory I researched. Fast forward to the 1600s, Japan is at peace, which is a weirdly awkward situation for an entire class of professional warriors, the samurais, with nothing left to fight. So the government's solution was to bureaucratize death. Beheading for commoners, seppuku as a privilege for samurais. Through my research, I encountered this book, Hagakure, written in 1716 by a former samurai who had personally served as a kaishakunin, the person who assists the seppuku. His name was Yamamoto Tsunemoto. I read through Hagakure, but it didn't mention anything about the soul in the belly. What's there instead was an obsession with shame. Don't live with it. Choose death over disgrace. That's the whole philosophy that was written there. Not one word about the stomach as a spiritual chamber. Not a single mention of Taoism, Qi, or anything below the belly button. All of the Chinese research I did was not connecting to what was actually happening in Japan at this point. But I saw a glimpse of hope when I found out about this Zen monk, Hakuin Ikaku. Around the same time Yamamoto published Hagakure, Hakuin collapsed from exhaustion after years of brutal training. Doctors couldn't help him. And then, for some reason, he goes to a Taoist hermit in Japan who teaches him a breathing technique on gathering your awareness in the lower belly. That same point below the belly button that the Chinese people focused on for immortality, the Tanden. I was extremely happy for a moment until I found out that what Hakuin was taught didn't have anything to do with immortality. He was only taught the breathing technique, and it was not for his Buddhist spiritual training. It was purely for his own recovery from training exhaustion. But this breathing technique eventually actually worked. He recovers, teaches it to his students, and it becomes his temple's signature practice. And it makes sense why this spread so fast among the samurais. The samurais already loved Zen. Zen Buddhism wasn't about memorizing Buddhist scriptures. It was about discipline and split-second clarity, exactly what a battlefield demands. So, once Hakuin handed them something this concrete, an actual point in the body to focus that discipline on, samurai training started centering on the Tanden itself. At this point, yes, I found out about somebody using Tanden, but it was still very shallow, and right about when I was about to give up. At the very end of my research, I found out about the truth. It was something that flipped all of my hard work upside down. In 1899, a Japanese man who grew up in a Christian household in Japan, educated largely in the United States, married to an American woman, and spent more of his adult life in Western institutions than in Japanese ones, sat down and wrote this book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And he writes it in English, not in Japanese. And he writes it for readers in America and Europe. And this is the detail that got me the most. Nothing in his biography suggests he ever personally witnessed a seppuku. In this book, he writes a single line that would end up outliving every other sentence in the book. He says the choice of that particular part of the body was based on an old anatomical belief as to the seat of the soul and of the affections. And then he goes further. He actually writes out the warrior's imagined thought process. I will open the seat of my soul and show you how it fares with it. See for yourself whether it is polluted or clean. Now, it's strange because it's not that he just made it up. Remember that I mentioned that the Japanese valued the stomach even before any contact with foreign countries? That is what he's actually drawing on. Not qi, not the Tao, not the Tanden. He never mentions any of the Chinese stuff anywhere in the book. He's the first person on record who connects an old, vague folk feeling about the stomach and 800 years of Japanese executions into a single, titty, deeply satisfying sentence. And it's satisfying. That's the problem. It's better storytelling than the truth. Japanese scholars noticed immediately about this, and one philosopher called the book's framing a delusion. A historian accused him of distorting Japan's image to the outside world. But it didn't matter. Theodore Roosevelt read the book and loved it. It's said to have shaped how he handled ending a war in Asia a few years later. Decades after that, John F. Kennedy listed the book as one of his favorite books. The West fell in love with an explanation that Japan's own historians were calling it wrong. A single man's connection made for foreign audience by someone who'd never seen the thing he was explaining is still the version almost everyone believes in today. And once that theory existed, Nitobe used it to explain Japan's present, not just its past. In 1912, General Nogi Maresuke and his wife, Shizuko, took their own lives by Seppuku on the day of Emperor Meiji's funeral. Nogi's own reasons, as far as we know, had nothing to do with any soul in the belly. He'd spent over a decade carrying guilt over the roughly 50,000 men who died under his command. It was also his way of showing the final act of personal loyalty to the emperor he'd served. None of that aligns with Nitobe's theory, but Nitobe, still alive at the time, wrote a public essay praising the deaths using the exact framework he'd invented 12 years earlier in his book. Here's what I walked away with. Almost nobody in this story planned to connect to anybody else. Then, one man, raised mostly outside of the culture he was explaining, sat down and connected these ideas into a single sentence for an audience that had no way to check his work. And that sentence became the truth. Not because it was accurate, because it was the first version anyone ever wrote down that made sense as a story. I think about that a lot, actually. How much of what we know today about any culture is just the first person who happened to connect the dots and happened to be believed? If you want to see where else this kind of digging takes me, subscribe. I've got a lot more of these.